Welcome to Special Interviews. I'm your host, Eugene Puyear, and joining us here today we have Mr. Gilad Atzmon.
Nice to meet you,
Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Atzmon.
Pleasure, mate.
Mr. Atzmon is a world-renowned saxophonist and also a world-renowned and somewhat controversial critic of the Israeli government's policies towards the Palestinian people. Now, Mr. Atzmon, I want to start out here a little bit by talking a little bit about why you're here. You're here in the United States on a tour. Can you tell us a little bit about why you thought it was important to come and where you've been so far?
It's a long list of cities. I'm here to talk about my book. My book, The Wandering Who, is basically a study of Jewish identity, politics, Jewish culture. I believe that if Israel defines itself as the Jewish state and its tanks and airplanes are decorated with Jewish symbols, we are entitled to ask, who are the Jews, what is Judaism, what is Jewishness, what is Zionism, what are the relationship between Zionism, the Jews, Zionism, Jewishness, Zionism and Judaism. A lot of people are interested in this topic, especially in America now, especially because the Jewish lobby here, AIPAC, is pushing this country into another global conflict in Iran, obviously. And yet, a lot of people try to stop me from talking about these issues. And I'm very happy that they try, because it only means that they realize that I'm engaged in a very important battle.
Well, to stay with AIPAC for a moment, recently here in Washington, D.C., we had the AIPAC National Convention. It was a very big deal. President Obama spoke, Benjamin Netanyahu spoke. Now, I know that your book deals a little bit, as you mentioned, with the Jewish lobbying apparatus, the Zionist lobbying apparatus here in the United States. And I wonder, because it's so often posited by AIPAC and others that this U.S. security relationship with Israel is absolutely paramount to keep America safe and that the American people must support Israel. Do you feel that this is a misconception?
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, I think that AIPAC is destroying America. And considering America being a superpower, it's actually probably the biggest threat to world peace. And if this is not enough, it is the biggest threat to Jews in America and maybe to Jews worldwide. Because these wars are dangerous. And it can turn a lot of people against Jews. Now, the most frightening aspect of Jewish culture, from my point of view, is that in spite of the fact that quite a few Jews can see how dangerous AIPAC is, Jews as communities, do not find within them the means to restrain those dangerous lobbies. And I am arguing for quite a while that the situation in America now is not very different from Weimar Republic, late 1920s. I'm talking about the events that led to the Holocaust, to the Shoah. They are seeking, very few people, more and more power. They're getting themselves involved into more and more lethal ideas, philosophies, practices. And at the end of the day, Jews end up paying for it, along millions of other people. This is a disaster. I wrote a book because I thought that I may be able to save the world and the Jews from another. I still hope. I'm here tonight because I try to promote the idea. A lot of people reading it. The book has been a bestseller for quite a while now. But I find it very frightening that in spite of the fact that few of the very important endorsers of this book, like Richard Falk, Professor Richard Falk, who argued that this book is important mainly for Jews who seek peace.
So for
it
you,
is actually
this book
the Jewish
is a
lobbies.
peacemaking. It's a peacemaking book, because there are many people who accuse you of being very divisive, who say that by singling out Jews as a people that you are in fact a racist. How do you respond to
this is a completely outrageous, because in my entire work I don't refer to Jews as people, ethnicity, or race. So it cannot be racist. But I do criticize Jewish culture, Jewish politics, Jewish identity politics, and I think that it should be legitimate to criticize culture. This is what we call cultural criticism. A lot of people criticize culture, but there is one culture that doesn't allow anyone, not even member within the community, to criticize itself.
Well, let me ask you.
And I'm not the first one.
Sure.
You know that there was a guy. I'm sure that many of your viewers heard about him. His name was Jesus, and he also came with kind of basically light criticism. He said, "Why can't we just love our neighbors?" And he found himself nailed to the cross. And there was a guy called Spinoza who came with a universal message, and he was kicked out. We have a very long tradition of intolerance toward dissent.
Well, and let me ask you, too, because your criticism comes from a very unique perspective. You're someone who was raised in Israel and was, in fact, a member of the IDF. So I wonder, what was it about your upbringing in Israel, your time in the IDF, that led you to become a critic of Zionism and ultimately led to you writing this book and being on this tour?
To tell you the truth, it is because I was an Israeli patriot. I took the Zionist dream very seriously. The Zionist initial dream was, it's not what I'm saying, this is what the early Zionists said, was to transform the Jew into a civilized human being. We, in Israel, my generation, many of us who were kind of, I wouldn't say politically oriented, but we took the Israeli narrative very seriously. We really believed in our righteousness, in our right to live in the promised land in Zion. And at a certain stage, and it took me a few years to realize the extent of the crime that I was involved with. At a certain stage, I realized that I was living on someone else's land, in Palestine, on Palestinian land. At a certain stage, I realized that while I was living in Tel Aviv, millions of Palestinians were kept in the diaspora as refugees and couldn't come to their home.
Right.
I, at a certain stage, didn't want to take it anymore. I just said, enough is enough. I don't want to live on anyone's land. And I immigrated to Britain. And I was happy for a while. But then, around 2003, I started to realize the extent of Jewish lobby in Britain. I found it peculiar that at the time Britain was taken into an illegal war, it was the Jewish lobby that was funding the Labour government.
And this is the war in Iraq that you're...
For sure, 2003. Yeah. At a certain stage, I realized the extent of Jewish and Zionist influence within the neoconservative school.
And what
that set the agenda to this war.
And is there any difference? We've mentioned AIPAC, and we've also mentioned the UK pro-Zionist lobby. Are these sort of one and the same? Are there differences between the two?
It is a big question. It is a big question. But categorically, and this is how I work in my book, rather than working as a sociologist or as an historian, or this is enough, I work as a philosopher. I operate as a philosopher. I'm educated as a philosopher. And what I really do, I divide Jewish identity into different categories. So, for instance, those who identify as Jews are sometimes those who regard themselves as the followers of the Torah, believers, observant Jews. That basically could be an innocent category in many cases. Second category are those who are defining themselves as Jews because they have Jewish ancestry, parents or what, or grandparents or whatever. But the third category is the most interesting, is those who regard themselves primarily as Jews. Sound very strange. The Zionist, one of the early Zionists who ended up Israeli president, Chaim Weizmann, said that there are no American Jews, French Jews, English Jews. There are Jews who live in America, Jews who live in France, Jews who live in Britain. What he really meant is the Jewishness is a primary quality. Now, whether the AIPAC and the Labor Friends of Israel or Conservative Friends of Israel have the same agenda, this is one question. What is clear, that they all operate as third category Jews. They see themselves primarily as Jews, which means that they succumb to their tribal interests. Their interests are prior to the interest of America or the interest of Britain or the interest of humanity. And this is very frightening. This is very frightening when a tribal lobby is leading America into war. This is not a war that necessarily, I think necessarily not going to serve American interests.
And what do you think some of the consequences could be of a war?
This is the biggest and the most frightening issue. It is very frightening. Because everyone understands that a conflict with Iran can escalate into a devastating nuclear conflict. Not because Iran possesses a bomb. I'm pretty sure that Iran doesn't possess a bomb, and all the intelligence briefings suggest that they don't. And the Iranians also say that that having a bomb is completely against the religion, and being the Islamic Republic of Iran, I obviously believe them. This can escalate into a nuclear conflict because Israel is definitely a nuclear superpower, and it's very irresponsible to its own actions due to lack of understanding the consequences of its actions. But we are sure that any attack on Iran would lead to a huge retaliation. And from that point, it is not clear where it is heading.
Well,
now,
please.
This is very important. A nuclear conflict would leave millions of casualties in the region. But it would also mature into a huge radioactive cloud. And this cloud will start to travel. And at a certain stage, it would reach Europe. Germany, Austria, Italy, Poland. And how do you think people in Poland or in Germany or in Austria or in France would react to such a death threat? Will they love Israel? Will they love their Jews? Obviously not. And this is the most crucial point. If Jews do care about the future, they must now do everything within their capacity to stop this irresponsible lobby for dragging us into a total disaster. And it is grave, the impotence that they perform. And again, you cannot blame any Jew because you can say, Moshe, Chaim, Yosef, where are you? Because they are not organized as a form of dissent. It's not a culture with an understanding of the culture of dissent. And the fact that I am silenced, and that, I mean, nobody managed to silence me. This is their problem. I'm quite vocal and I have a lot of followers. The fact that they attempt to silence me is actually symptomatic to their cultural, to the cultural incapacity to deal with such a problem.
Sure. Well, I want to talk a little bit about the future. You mentioned going forward in the future, and AIPAC also continually puts forward, as does the United States government and various other forces, that the ultimate solution to the Palestinian conflict is a two-state solution.
Yeah.
Now, how do you feel about that? Because I've seen in your writings that you've been very critical of the two-state solution as it's propagated.
It's very simple. Israel is a one state. Israel is a one state. It has natural border. It has one sewage system, one electric grid, one telephone pre-dial area code. Where is the problem? It is one state. It is one state that is dominated by a racist, expansionist philosophy. Why? Because it defines itself as the Jewish state. By defining itself as a Jewish state, it actually succumbs to an exceptionalist view that prefers its Jewish citizens on all others. It means that Palestinian citizens in Israel, because most Palestinians are not even citizens, they are actually prisoners, but the Palestinian prisoners in Israel, they are kind of 6, 7, or 8 rate citizens. They had before them the Jewish Ashkenazi elite, and then the Sephardi elite, and then the ordinary Sephardi, and then the ordinary Ashkenazi, and then the Arab Jews, who are actually the majority of Jews in Israel, who are far below, and then Ethiopian Jews that are black and are not even entitled to donate blood, and somewhere down the line you find the Palestinians. In order to deal with this issue, Israel must become a state of its citizens. There was a Palestinian parliament member, Knesset member, who said, this is what we have to do. He had to run for his life. His name was Azmi Bashara. What he offered? He suggested that Israel becomes a state of its citizen, like in America. If I decide to immigrate to America and I become a citizen, in terms of right, we would be equal. We support it all over the world. Why don't we support it in the Jewish state? Why? Because our politicians are subject to pressure of Jewish lobbies. Why they're subject to such a pressure? Because the Jewish lobby in America, in Britain, in France, in Canada, realized 2-3 decades ago that a Western politician is much cheaper than a tank. And this is devastating. However, all we have to do in Palestine in order to save the situation is to turn it into a state of its citizen. Benjamin Netanyahu or any other Israeli prime minister should do is to stand up and to say, we are very sorry. We understand what happened here in this region for the first time. We ethnically cleansed so many Palestinians. We have now 7 million Palestinian refugees around the world. Hello, my brothers, my Palestinian brothers. Please come home. Let's live together. This would be the true embodiment of the Zionist dream. The Jews can manage to come back to their land and even to live in peace. It won't just resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It would resolve 2,000 years of Jewish agony, of skirmishes with their neighbors. This is very simple. Can the Jews in Israel lead to such a reconciliation? Maybe, but they have to be de-Zionized first. They have to be de-Judaized, not to leave the Jewish religion, not to stop being Jews, but to detach themselves, to drift away from the Jewish supremacist ideas that are based on chosenness, to stop being chosen. To stop being chosen is to become human.
Well, you know, we've talked so much about the distortions, whether it's on the two-state solution, whether it's AIPAC, but I wonder on your tour is called the Grassroots Tour, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. What have you seen, what has been the breadth, the depth of the support you've seen for the Palestinian cause in America? I mean, is the AIPAC consensus something that, you know, you're seeing all people for, or have you seen people come out and really been for the Palestinian people?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There is no doubt that all over in the West, there is massive support for the Palestinian people. In counter proportions to what we see within politics, because while our politics in the West is dominated by different Jewish lobbies, here it's AIPAC, in Britain 80% of the Tory parliament, the leading party MPs, parliament members, 80% are friends of conservative friends of Israel. They all care about Israel. How many of them care about Liverpool, about Rochester, about Hartlepool? And the people in Liverpool and Rochester understand that something is going wrong. But I tell you something else. I tell my audience that with 50 million Americans in deep poverty, and I had some statistics that suggest that 40% of the Americans are about to flip, that they are dependent on the next paycheck. We are all Palestinians. We are all, I'm here for 3 weeks in this country. I'm going around and I don't see the poor people of America. Why? Because this society is now heavily segregated.
Well, one thing I want to really get your response to is one thing we've seen here in America quite a bit, especially in the Republican Party presidential debates, is this idea that the Palestinians are an invented people, a made-up people, and that, you know, they have no rights because they do not exist. I wonder how you respond to that.
It is almost funny because the only research into invention of people, you know, that we are aware of is actually a book that was a bestseller in Israel by an Israeli professor called Shlomo Zand, and it is called The Invention of the Jewish People. Now, people are invented. People are invented. The Jewish people were invented as people 110 years ago. And this is well documented. The problem with people who invent themselves start when they start to celebrate their national or patriotic symptoms on the expense of others. And this is exactly what we see in Palestine. Now, there is no doubt that Palestinian culture has been there since time began. But even if Palestinians started to understand or to internalize their national existence as the outcome of the Zionist movement by means of negation. So what? So the day the first Jewish immigrant arrived in Palestine with a Zionist ideology, this was the birth of the Palestinian identity, even if the Zion is correct here, if Newt Greenwich is correct. So it means that the Palestinian nation, according to this philosophy, is exactly as old as the Zionist movement. So it's a completely idiotic argument.
With just a few minutes left, one thing I want to get really your thoughts on very quickly is, you know, in your writings you also use the term apartheid as to describe the Israeli policies. And I think that that's something that people in America often don't understand. Can you say why you think that's an apt term?
Yeah, I think that it's a very important term because people in America understand what apartheid is an organized system of discrimination. Actually, I argue that it's not apartheid. I argue that it's far worse. Because while apartheid is a system of exploitation of the indigenous, what we see in Israel is an attempt to get rid of the Palestinians as people. The Israelis dream to wake up in the morning and to find out that they just left. To a certain extent, yeah? This aspect of Israeli political thinking is very similar to the Nazi Lebensraum, living space. That was not a system of exploitation, it was a system that was indulged in racially motivated, expansionist, nationalist philosophy. This is what we see in Israel. The settlement, the racist, expansionist philosophy. It's Lebensraum, living space. This is very, very frightening.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us once again, Mr.
Pleasure,
Gilad Atzmon.
And
the new book is The Wandering Who, 0 books. You can get it on Amazon
yeah,
store,
sure.
all over the place. Thank you again for joining us, and good luck on the rest of your tour.
Thank you so much.
Again, I'm Eugene Puyear. Thank you so much for joining us here on Special Interviews.